The NeXT computer, the computer company that Steve Jobs built between when he was at Apple in the 1980s and when he came back to Apple in the late 1990s. About a month ago was the 30th anniversary of the creation of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web on his NeXT Cube. I own some NeXTStations, which are the follow-on to the NeXT Cube. There are two fantastic recent videos on NeXT systems. I'm going to link to them. I would go watch them first. This video is about the power supply system of the NeXTStation. I'll be perfectly honest, this video is somewhat an excuse for me to point a camera at some nifty vintage hardware and talk about it and show it running. I hope you enjoy. First, this video is going to be a few minutes of talking about how power supplies work. If you want to skip to vintage hardware, go to this time in the video. Here is my breakdown in the high-level overview. These are the great things, these are the okay things, these are the probably should have been done differently things. The OS was great, it was solid, it was Unix based. PostScript windowing system, stuff that you printed on the PostScript printer, came out exactly the way that they looked on the screen. The application development suite became Mac OS X internal SCSI drive, an external SCSI port. It had built-in Ethernet many years before most systems had that. Those are great things. Things that are okay, that were fine but didn't necessarily push it ahead of anything. Power supply setup, which I'm going to talk about later in this video. The proprietary printer interface was a little weird. Two decisions that are in the category. Different than everybody else, but it wasn't better. The worm drive was a way to get around having a removable floppy but also a separate hard drive. It was very, very, very slow. The worm drives was only in some of the early Q. By the time they got to the NeXTStations, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about because I have that hardware, the 2-bit per pixel mono monitor goes through the NeXTStations, the mono NeXTStations, but not the color NeXTStations. If we move forward out of the Cube era, then the worm drive no longer is a thing. NeXTStations all came with a SCSI hard drive, 2 bits per pixel mono monitor. Every pixel had white or black or 2 shades of gray. 640 by 480, which was VGA, was years away when the NeXT monochrome system was being spec'd. Going with a 2 bits per pixel monochrome display probably wasn't such an awful idea, but it was one of those things that the first question I'm sure people started to ask was, why doesn't it have color? Going with this mono monitor, they tied themselves to their weird power supply setup. When they went to the color NeXTs and they ditched this, then they were still tied to the power supply circuitry. So the way a PC power supply works, when the AC is live, you get the standby power line is live. The power supply section of the motherboard is on, but the main power supply lines to the CPU are off. This sends voltage on one side of the switch. This is the soft power switch on the front of the case. When you close that switch, it sends power back here. This closes a switch. It turns power, which ultimately comes from the standby line, back to the on line that goes to the power supply. The power supply that actuates some switch inside the power supply, and then the +5 turns on, the +12 turns on, and then at some point the power good line turns on, at which point the whole motherboard powers up. Another example of standby power and a soft power switch comes from this game console, my Sony PlayStation 2, which came out about 10 years after the NeXT did. PlayStation 2 has a hard power switch and a soft power switch. So now it's 0 watts. We turn on the hard power switch on the back, which brings the power consumption up to 15, 16 watts. The standby power goes on, the red light comes on in the front, and so then this becomes the soft power switch. If I press it, the console goes up to a little over 110 watts to power up, and we get the display screen and the thing powers up with a green light. To power it off, we have to hold down the soft power switch. It turns back off, power drops back to 16 watts. The NeXT power supply system and power supply circuitry works differently than the PC. Here's the power supply, here's the line in. If we energize the AC line into the power supply, nothing happens on the power supply. There's no standby power. The only circuitry on the motherboard that's energized is this plus 3 volt lithium battery. So the plus 3 volt lithium battery, I presume, is wired to something that goes over one of the 19 pin monitor connector and goes then through the monitor connector to the keyboard to a hot side of a switch, I guess. And so when you hit the power key, then that closes that switch. It sends power back over one of these other lines, power back over one of these lines to the motherboard, which then sends the power to the on input of the power supply, which then energizes the plus 12, minus 12, plus 5, and then everything turns on and it boots. But what kicks all that process off is the plus 3 volts that comes from the battery. So you cannot turn on a NeXT without an operational motherboard battery. The original NeXT monochrome monitor is powered by the plus 12 and the minus 12 from the power supply, which is why the minus 12 has to have like 3 amp capability. These are the types of batteries that are used in the NeXT motherboard. They are a small 2/3 of a size A battery, 3 volt lithium, Panasonic by Matsushita. You can see the details of the battery there. What's amazing about these batteries is their longevity. I bought a dozen NeXT machines about 20 years ago, and so I had batteries in all of them. The ones that have gone stone dead I have disposed of. I have 6 currently, and so I'm going to check them. 3.08, not bad. 293 millivolts, that one's dead. 3.04, pretty good. 3.2, that's fantastic for a 3 volt battery. 3.44, 3.42. So these batteries are almost 30 years old. These were in NeXT computers sitting in the motherboards probably most of 10 years. The motherboard logic design is a very low current. These batteries are extraordinary. That's another interesting fact about these machines. This is the body of a NeXTStation Mono. It's model number N1100, part number 1715. Here's the back. A 50-pin SCSI connector. You have 2 RS423, I believe, serial ports. You have the DSP port. You have the 19-pin monochrome monitor port, which is proprietary printer out. You have Ethernet, and then the power supply connector with the power supply cooling fins. The back of the case is lined with holes, so air can flow in there. Air flows into the case through the holes in the back, flows across the motherboard. 68040 processor with a passive heatsink gets enough cooling from that. The air flows across the case, across the CPU, across everything else, down into this fan, which is angled, and then the air flows along these fins out the back. And while doing so, it's cooling this power supply. The power supply is here. It's fairly thin. The bottom of the power supply is a big slab of aluminum, and that conductively goes against here, which couples to the cooling fins. The power supply connector to the motherboard is here. Here is the pinout. Minus 12. There's plus 5. There's plus 12. There is a reset. There's a power good out, there's ground, and then there's a voltage on. You'll notice that there's no standby power. The power to turn on the power supply comes from the motherboard battery. So the battery has to have enough voltage to turn on the power supply. Actual branded NeXT power cable. This is one of the good batteries that from my testing ground. 19-pin monitor cable. Carries both signal and power. So one of the newer cables with the L. I don't care as much about it. That plugs in. Keyboard plugs in there. Alrighty. And now we see if it turns on. System test failed. I wonder what that's about. And that's well, that's exciting. Not an auspicious first boot of that computer. I suspect there's a problem with the RAM. I will post a later video of one of my other NeXT computers after I've figured out which was the bad RAM stick and replaced it. I hope you enjoyed that video. Please click like and subscribe. If you want to see more videos about vintage computer hardware, please leave a comment and never stop figuring stuff out. Hey, how you doing?